and a participant in the continuing talks in Havana with Gino Costa, the former Minister of the Interior from Peru. He's been heavily involved in the peace process in El Salvador and will speak about that. And I think he may also make some remarks about how his own country has reduced the threat from Sendero Luminoso. The third speaker on my immediate left is Dr. Dino Patijalal from Indonesia, former Vice Foreign Minister of Indonesia. His country has faced diverse internal security challenges almost ever since independence in the 1940s, and the situation there is now hugely improved, particularly since the resolution of the very serious previous conflicts in East Timor and Aceh, which Dino will mention, I think, in his own comments. And our fourth speaker on my far left is Senen Bachani, who is a member of the government peace negotiating panel in the Philippines. The Philippines has suffered from long-running armed conflict, most dangerously in the south of the country, where the government signed a peace agreement in January last year with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. So our four panelists are all exceptionally well qualified to be on this panel and to speak in this session. I'll now invite each of them to speak in turn, following which we'll have an opportunity for delegates to pose questions and for discussion of the matters that have been raised. So first, we look forward to hearing from General Naranjo.
Muchas gracias.
Many thanks to our hosts, to the organizers, to the minister, and to the full team that allows us today from Cartagena, with an international audience such as the one we have here, be able to share with you where we are, where we come from, and where we would like to go with the peace process that the government of Colombia is currently working on with the FARC guerrilla. I would like to apologize from Humberto de la Calle, who originally would have been here this afternoon, but precisely to be able to cover his responsibility in the Havana negotiations, he has not been able to make it to this meeting with all of you. And something that I must also say, perhaps to begin, is the good news that in Havana we have just reached a partial agreement within what we have called in the Havana the measures to descale the conflict to be able to begin immediately specific tasks that allow us to progress towards overcoming a problem that unfortunately today places Colombia as the second country with the most mines installed in its territory. Thank you for allowing us the truth is that the parties will receive an applause from me as a message of encouragement to continue persevering in this negotiation and the progress that is being made. So I would like to tell this audience and point out where we are headed. I would like to clarify 3 or 4 things. The first is that the state of Colombia, the government of Colombia and Colombians, we did not reach this process as a result of the collapse of a failed state. We are not here facing a negotiation because our state gave in to the challenges it faced as a state. And secondly, we did not begin this process on a vision and reality that the government represents a totalitarian, dictatorial, or autocratic regime. Far from that, Colombia begins this process with the firm conviction that we are representing a society, and particularly a democratic state. And third, we did not reach the state of negotiation to begin this process as a result of what one might call a typical tie, military, that is negative when facing an adversary such as the guerrilla, the FARC. On the contrary, we reached this point as the result of the accumulation of a process that represented the institutional strengthening of the last 15 years, which has represented a better performance of the military forces, police forces, and justice when facing the large challenges that organized crime represents for Colombia, as well as drug trafficking and the guerrillas. And we have reached this point on the foundation of a political decision, which is anchored in an ethical principle. Allow me to express to you that for 46 or 47 years, surrounding the FARC, there were many myths, and one of them said, and it had been proved up until now, that the FARC was something like a bubble that was completely protected for 46, 47 years. None of the leaders of the FARC had been able to be captured by public forces. And what happened? What happened is that with the institutional strengthening, there was progressive progress, but firm progress, until we reached the results that began by neutralizing leaders of the FARC, but that in the end, under the President Juan Manuel Santos, who is leading this process, we have been able to neutralize the maximum leader of the FARC. So the first question that one must ask himself, or the question that we are asked in regards to this process, is what led the President to make the decision to begin a process looking for a negotiated solution to this problem? And it was a tremendous dose of magnanimity, because after having neutralized the main leader of the FARC, there were two political decisions: either to continue with the war, to try to neutralize and end the last guerrilla fighter, or to clearly and politically anchored in an ethical decision to say the time has come for us to sit down and find a negotiated solution. It would have been easy for any leader in Latin America to have continued with this war and continued with the comfort of a war that was producing results, and that in the end would have received applause, to continue with the inertia of a policy that is an offensive to counter the guerrilla. And yet the President believed that the best choice they could make, those who were not within the law, was that in Colombia they had breached the gap so that the use of weapons, the power of weapons, would allow access to power. Secondly, the President of the Republic believed that they had conceived and created a balance in favor of the state in this negotiation, that the supremacy of our military forces, of our police forces, of the state of Colombia over the irregular ones makes this a completely asymmetric confrontation, and as such, it is not being negotiated from the foundation of this negative military impact. And thirdly, we have the support of the international community that believes that Colombia deserves peace and should sign an agreement that reaches an end to this conflict. To say so briefly, because I know that time here is very valuable, I would like to say that this decision required the study of 37 models of negotiation and lessons learned from other conflicts. And in regards to Colombia's case, they made decisions to overcome what, with good faith and with the best of intentions, with a political decision from presidents in the past, they began, and unfortunately they were not able to complete. But with the frustration of Colombians, they needed to correct these mistakes or these models. And this is at the core of this negotiation. What was done initially was to, in an exploratory phase and a confidential phase, to shorten the agenda we have with the FARC. For the first time in Colombia's negotiations in Colombia with the FARC, they reduced the debate to 6 axes, 6 themes and 1 of implementation, with which we would sit to discuss on an open agenda, which would mean the refounding of the state of Colombia. Secondly, it was decided on that after reaching this agenda that was achieved in August 2012, they would begin an open dialogue, which, founded on these 5 issues, should reach an end to the conflict through an agreement. And I say this because in Colombia, we have introduced in a realistic fashion the vision that signing an agreement that reaches an end to conflict does not mean reaching peace automatically. It doesn't mean that in a magical way we're going to reach or find peace. And that's why the third stage of this process, what we have called post-conflict, and the construction of stable and long-lasting peace once these agreements have been signed. Today, we would like to share with you that we are reaching the completion of 3 of these 6 points that I've mentioned. We have reached the fundamental agreements on the rural and agricultural world and the need to transform rural areas of Colombia. We have also progressed on the second point, which is key, and that also draws the attention that in Colombia and in the world it is not valued sufficiently. And why do we say this? Because it is precisely point 2 on this agreement, which is political participation and guarantees to participation, which allows the fundamental decision of the FARC of giving up to a life of weapons to turn into a political movement and practice politics and participate in politics at the end of a process that hopes to reach an end to conflict. That's what is desired, that access to power be access under democratic rules without the use of weapons. And we have progressed on a third agreement that has been very controversial regarding solving the drug problem. And I say this here with full humility and simplicity. Wherever we go, they ask us, what does the Colombian state do? And negotiators of the government sitting at a table speaking of drug dealing with the FARC that, as is well known, have lived for a long time from drug dealing that has financed them. And the answer, which should be obvious, but it is not so obvious, is the following. Not having discussed, not having negotiated, not having reached an agreement so that the FARC would acknowledge directly and expressly that they have been financed by drug dealing, but that specifically they will break all ties that they have had or have with drug trafficking, and simultaneously will begin through several different routes and in an effective manner a contribution with state institutions to overcome the problem. It would have been unforgivable. But allow me to now place the rear view window of other negotiations. When we analyze the great achievement that there was with all the defects that involved to have demobilized the paramilitaries, nearly 25,000 paramilitaries, one might say that that's a negotiation of, well, it's a place nowhere in the agreement do they speak of drug trafficking, because they jumped over drug trafficking. They ignored it, assuming that it was financed by drug trafficking and there were previous warlords participating in this paramilitary process. We, the government, we have tried to overcome that situation to offer full clarity that the end of the conflict also means an end to drug trafficking for these illegal groups. And today, where we are, and with this I wrap up the first part of the intervention, is solving some crucial issues in regards to victims. The government of Colombia has determined that victims must be at the core of the agreement. In other words, we must ensure that there be justice, truth, preparation, and rights for there not to be a repetition of this violence. And simultaneously, we're also speaking of transitional justice, which I hope to be able to speak more of at a different moment in my intervention. And this is what I can present to you today of our situation. And the safety that your leadership here, represented for the world, will accompany this process. The safety that the government hopes to receive any criticism, suggestion, or questions within the framework of a democratic state that truly understands that pluralism is what builds, and pluralism that is based on political debate is which allows us to create a consensus to be able to progress and overcome 5 decades of violence that our country has suffered. Thank you very much.
for that brilliant summary of the progress of talks between your government and FARC. You touched on many important points in your address, but I think one that stood out was two that stood out were firstly the government's rationale for negotiating, and secondly the importance of creating a sustainable post-conflict society. But I think there were many points that you raised that will provoke questions and discussion later on. So thank you very much. Now I turn to Dr. Gino Costa. Thank you.
Muy buenas tardes. Muchas gracias.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I would like to speak of the experience in El Salvador and in the peaceful solution to the conflict that the country faced. But first of all, I would like to make an introduction to the Latin America subject, especially for our friends coming from Asia. Latin America, in the last 200 years nearly, has been a relatively peaceful region in regards to international conflicts. We had two large international conflicts in the 19th century with the Triple Alliance War and the Pacific War, and some minor conflicts to define territorial borders. But in general, moving beyond that, the 20th century has been a relatively peaceful century. Like I say, in regards to international, when comparing internationally, this is not the case with the domestic conflicts that have been abundant in the region, especially as a result or after the Cuban Revolution, which has been the first successful insurgency in Latin America. In fact, there are only two successful insurgencies in the region. Cuba is the first in 1959, and Nicaragua is the second in 1979. And among both of these, there is a combination of insurgencies, armed insurgencies, that have been militarily defeated in the region, some larger than others. But between Cuba in 1959 and Nicaragua in 1979, like I said, there are many failures in regards to insurgencies, armed insurgencies. In the decade of the 80s, apart from the case in El Salvador and Guatemala that began as far back as the insurgency of Colombia, we also have the experience of the armed insurgency in Peru, the Sendero Luminoso mainly, and another terrorist group, a smaller one. I would like to briefly speak of Peru's experience and then that of El Salvador, and see what comparisons or what lessons might be pertinent to the challenges that Colombia faces now. In the case of Peru, I believe it is less relevant for today's discussion in Colombia because here we were very fortunate in being able to disconnect both terrorist organizations in a relatively short period of time. And here we can see the comparison with Colombia due to the combination of two main factors. On the one hand,
las Fuerzas Armadas con los campesinos en las zonas rurales del país y la organización de la población campesina en rondas campesinas y en comités de autodefensa que contribuye al aislamiento sobre todo de Sendero Luminoso y la MRTA en el campo, y por otro lado la acción de la inteligencia policial en las ciudades, que es la que permite, digamos, desarticular el comando político y militar de estas dos organizaciones subversivas a principios de los años 90. Fuimos afortunados porque la estrategia que llevó a acabar con estos dos grupos fue entender que se trataba de organizaciones muy jerárquicas y que golpeando la cabeza y destruyéndola podía colapsar el conjunto de la estructura armada de estas dos organizaciones, y ese fue el caso, afortunadamente, y eso permitió, como digo, en un tiempo relativamente corto, aunque con muchísimas víctimas y muchísimo dolor en el camino, acabar con estos dos grupos políticos militares. En el caso salvadoreño, la experiencia es distinta porque no hay solución militar al conflicto y se llega a una mesa de negociaciones. Curiosamente, a diferencia de Colombia, no porque el gobierno quisiera buscar la solución negociada como ha ocurrido acá, más bien han sido las FARC las reacias a sentarse a la mesa de negociaciones. En Colombia ha sido necesario, como decía el general Naranjo, golpearlas reiteradamente y golpearlas mucho militarmente para forzarlas, de alguna manera, si vale el término, a sentarse a la mesa de negociaciones. En El Salvador es al revés, es la guerrilla la que hace un esfuerzo reiterado por demostrar que tiene la capacidad militar para no ser derrotada y que por tanto si se quiere evitar un conflicto muy extenso es necesario encontrar la solución en la mesa de negociaciones. Y confluyen además en el caso de Salvador fenómenos internacionales que explican esto, que es el fin de la Guerra Fría. La guerrilla se da cuenta que no tiene oxígeno para seguir con el esfuerzo militar. Y por otro lado, los propios errores de los militares salvadoreños frente a la ofensiva del año 89, que lleva entre otras cosas al asesinato de los jesuitas, lleva al congelamiento de la ayuda por parte del gobierno americano. Y eso también facilita las condiciones para una solución negociada. Muy bien, entonces yo quisiera en general decir que, como mencionaba al principio, muchas insurrecciones armadas, muchos conflictos internos, la mayoría de ellos resueltos militarmente, a excepción de los conflictos en Colombia y en América Central con El Salvador y Guatemala. Entonces, para nuestros amigos asiáticos, en esas dos, en Colombia y en América Central, se puede...
In these situations and in Central America, we can learn a lot from the experience in Latin America for negotiated solutions and political ones to armed conflicts. What are the parallels that we can draw from El Salvador? What lessons can it leave us? I was saying that there is a common element, which is a military solution that has not been resolved. I'm not going to talk about a tie because I agree with what the general pointed out, but I would say that the continuation of the conflict is very costly and that there are conditions for finding a third way. There are also important differences between Colombia and El Salvador. Many, certainly, but two important differences that I would like to note. One is the presence of drugs, which here explains the massive extension of the conflict and the long time that it has gone on. And in the second place, the Rome statutes and the presence of the International Criminal Court, which did not exist 20-odd years ago in El Salvador. That made it a lot easier to find this formula with which to negotiate peace. There weren't the difficulties that international norms imply for the incorporation of the former guerrillas into the political processes of a nation. In El Salvador, we neither have drugs nor the difficulties presented by the Rome Statutes, and the negotiation process is ultimately destined to seeing how the guerrilla group can be incorporated into the political process, and in exchange, the guerrilla in El Salvador was able to achieve some institutional, constitutional reformations, which guaranteed its continued participation in politics. For instance, a new civil police force was created, and there were some other reforms to the armed forces. So the crux of the negotiation is that, the institutional reforms, which is to say, how much is the government willing to give in terms of government concessions in order to demobilize the guerrilla. So in terms of the post-conflict, a few comments. Post-conflict and peace building. I would say that in El Salvador, it was a successful process. The guerrilla was incorporated to the political process. Today, we have a second president from the former guerrilla in power after 4 presidents from the party that established peace. So in political terms, the peace agreements were very successful. Nevertheless, the post-conflict was very violent. Despite the fact that the peace was signed, the violence, terrorist violence, was replaced by petty crime. So here there are lessons to be learned. Should we achieve the peace treaty in Colombia, how can we prevent such a violent confrontation as the one seen in Salvador? It's true that there are different explanations for this. One of them is the sum of institutional agreements that were signed, and then the implementation of these, which is to say, it was a government that refused to accept the institutional reform that was in charge of those institutional reforms because it was in power for 20 years after the end of the conflict. Perhaps that can explain the manner in which those reforms were conducted and the weaknesses that they displayed. In the second place, there has been a certain disregard to the need to attend to the social and economic situation of the demobilized former guerrillas, and also a disregard to social and economic variables. In Salvador, in the post-conflict era, has not grown significantly. It has not developed its production systems, and all of this has generated a social situation full of tensions. There's also the presence of deportation processes for people who are in conflict with the United States law, not just from Salvador, but also Honduras and Guatemala. This in part explains the criminality, the situation with regards to criminality that these countries are facing. So these are factors that fortunately do not affect Colombia. But I mention these because they must be taken into account. And in order to be able to guarantee the political incorporation of the guerrillas into the process, an important actor was the international community through the verification of those agreements. First, by facilitating the negotiations, which is taking place nowadays with Colombia as well, and secondly, by means of a mechanism to facilitate the implementation of the agreements and to conduct follow-up. What relevance does this have to the Colombian case? And with this, I'll wrap up. I believe, as General Naranjo said, that Colombia is entering this process of negotiation not on the defensive, but rather on the offensive, institutionally strengthened in terms of its military, its police, and with the rule of law from its own sturdy social and economic base. This is one of the great strengths that the government negotiating this peace enjoys. Another factor is that it comes into this with the great successful experience of having demobilized other groups prior, perhaps not such large and ambitious groups as the FARC, but there have been 5 demobilizations in this country that have been executed directly by the government. And they have been managed well from the military perspective as well as the social perspective, providing services to the demobilized forces. I am under the impression that the agreements that have been achieved indicate a great opportunity to certainly end the war, but also a great opportunity to consolidate democracy and consolidate the presence, the institutional presence of the state throughout the territory and in the regions. We can only hope that the efforts made so far will be maintained and that the necessary resources will be invested in peace building so that it may be, in fact, an irreversible process. It won't be easy because, as we know, there are groups, criminal groups, that have been transformed not so much from the old guerrillas, but paramilitary groups transformed into criminal organizations. Probably some of this will happen with certain components of the FARC. That will be, of course, one of the great challenges before us. But if these peace negotiations are successful, it will be a great opportunity to finish consolidating democracy and the presence of the state in the regions. Thank you very much.
Dr. Costa, thank you so much for your very useful exposition of some of the similarities and differences between the internal security challenges that were faced in El Salvador and presently in Colombia. You pointed to some important potential lessons from the El Salvador experience that might be relevant in the case of Colombia, and I was particularly struck by your emphasis on the need to avoid post-conflict violence, and you pointed to some of the factors and policies that might indeed help in that direction. So thank you again. I now turn to Dino Patijalal and look forward to hearing what you have to say about the Indonesian experience. Thank you.
Good morning. First, I want to say that I disagree with previous speakers who said that it took 40 hours to get from Asia to Colombia, because it took me only 38 and a half hours, actually. So I don't know what airline they took here. And I also want to thank John Chipman and Tim and all the friends at IISS for inviting me to this conference. And I have sin to confess to. I've been a diplomat for 30 years, never been to Colombia once. So I'm glad that I have this opportunity. As a politician, I have about 250,000 followers Twitter in my country, and I'll promise in the next 2 days I will tweet every day about Colombia for free. Okay. You can clap. It's illegal to clap. Okay, I want to talk about our experience in dealing with the conflict in Aceh, because I think there's a lot of similarities to what Colombia experiencing and some other Latin American countries. But the 5 elements that I want to leave you with are these in our efforts to resolve a conflict. One is leadership, pragmatism, forward-looking mindset, reconciliation, and patience. So all these elements were at play in how we resolve the conflict in Aceh, which was really one of the most difficult and bloody conflicts in our history. It was brewing for about 30 years, 3 decades. It was very hard to crack because GAM, the Free Aceh movement, which is the equivalent of FARC here, I would say, was a formidable military force. They were very effective, very disciplined. They were trained in Libya. They were very ideological, and they were bent on creating an independent Aceh state, independent from the Republic of Indonesia. Tens of thousands of people had died from the conflict, and the casualty from our side, especially from our military, was also considerable. Now, after 30 years of conflict, by the time of 2004, there was no sign of peace. And in fact, the military situation was deteriorating, and there was no hope of renewed talks between the government and GAM. But this changed in 2004 at the end of the year. And what changed it? It was the force of God. It was the tsunami. You know, we had this most horrible tsunami in December. 200,000 people in Aceh died. Aceh was flattened. Some parts of it, like it was hit by a nuclear bomb. And psychologically and politically, it hit everybody on the ground, not just nationally in Indonesia, but especially those in Aceh, and especially those fighting the conflict. So here we saw an opportunity. The opportunity was there was an opening created by this immense suffering for political negotiations. So we sent messages to the GAM soldiers on the ground. We asked them if they wanted to negotiate, and they said, we're suffering enough. We do want the best for the people of Aceh, but this has to be decided by our leadership abroad. And the leaders abroad were based in Europe, so we took it to them if they wanted to negotiate a peace settlement, and this was aided by former President of Finland, Martti Ahtisaari, as the facilitator. And what happens was quite remarkable. It involved only 5 rounds. The first 2 rounds were difficult, but come the 3rd round, they had changed their call for independence. And after that, it only took 2 more negotiations to finalize a peace agreement in Aceh, a historic one. So about 5 to 6 months, 5 rounds of negotiations, and the negotiations were concluded. So that's what has happened, and that peace has held up until today. How do you explain it? Well, one is definitely leadership. Leadership was very critical in this. President Yudhoyono, when he took power, he said, we got to change the way we dealt with the GAM forces. He believed that there can be no solution based solely on military solution. Long-lasting solution would require a political settlement, peaceful political settlement, and that's what we pursued. It required also a win-win approach. It cannot be a win-lose approach as in the past, and it has to deliver what is called peace with dignity. So whatever happens after that, there are no losers, and everybody kept their dignity. And the bottom line for us was there would be no separation of Aceh from the Republic of Indonesia. So that's leadership. Change the attitude, change the way we dealt with the conflict. Secondly is pragmatism. Pragmatism was crucial because for us the bottom line was Aceh should not separate from Indonesia. And we were willing to negotiate anything beyond that. So anything under the sun they could ask, and we're willing to consider it. One of the most difficult demands from the GAM forces were that our military, the TNI, should be out of Aceh. Now, this was very difficult because, what government would accept to its military being out of a specific area? But we were able to agree to it in exchange for the total dismantlement of the GAM military force. Again, this took a lot of hard negotiations, but in the end, it was achieved. They also requested international observers to monitor the peace agreement. This was not easy to accept in the context of Indonesia's political culture, but we took the risk, we accepted it, and before long, we were able to finalize the major points of the peace agreement. Third was forward-looking approach. And again, this is particular to Indonesia. I don't know if it will work for other countries, but there was a sensitive issue relating to human rights. Over the last 30 years, there was a lot of military operations. Both the military and the GAM forces had committed human rights on, on quite a large scale. There was a big question, fundamental question. What do you do? Do you look back and ask for accountability, or do you both recognize that mistakes have been made and you move on? We opted for the second one, which is forgive and move on and look forward. And it wasn't an easy decision. It wasn't. Some politicians were angry, some of the families were angry, but we thought this was a pragmatic solution to end a very bitter conflict. And fourth, reconciliation. This was entirely necessary. There can be no peace agreement without reconciliation in post-conflict era. And this was achieved by changing our mindset from treating them like an enemy, as it was before, to a political partner. I think the most vivid illustration was when GAM military forces came down from the hills and they gave their weapons and surrendered their colors and their uniforms, and they were integrated into society, given jobs. There was an economic program that made sure that they were treated not just with dignity, but with the economic opportunity as everybody else. So that's what happened in Aceh. It required a lot of persistence, risk-taking, and patience. And what has been achieved in Aceh are three things. One, we have been able now in Indonesia to dismantle GAM forces as a military force and transform them into political stakeholder. They take part in the elections. They have their own political party. They actually won the elections. Now the governor in Aceh is a former GAM leader. And not only that, we took care to integrate GAM members into society socially, economically, and culturally. Secondly, what has happened since the peace is that Aceh now has been fully rebuilt and rehabilitated from the tsunami. If you go there, you would not know that there was a tsunami 10 years ago. In fact, the UN has said that the tsunami rehabilitation in Aceh is one of the best in the world. And why was that possible? Because we got peace, right? Without the peace, there would be no rehabilitation from the tsunami. And third and last, in Aceh now, we are not suffering from a temporary ad hoc peace. What we have is real peace and permanent peace on the ground, and that has delivered huge differences in the daily lives of Acehnese and the continuation of the Republic of Indonesia. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Dino. That was an excellent summary of the various elements of the peace process in Aceh. You touched on issues of leadership, pragmatism, the importance of a forward-looking approach, the need for reconciliation, and lastly, you talked about the rehabilitation from the tsunami damage, all clearly important points, and I think some of them would have a much wider relevance as well. So that's great. Thank you. And finally, Mr. Senen Bachani.
Good afternoon. I'd like to share with you our experience in the Philippines about the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro. Let me start with some global context other countries see in our process, in our domestic process in the Philippines. Our process has been widely viewed as a bright spot in today's particularly conflict-ridden world. It came after a relative scarcity in concluded negotiations since the second decade of the 21st century. In contrast, during the first decade, so many significant agreements were forged in various countries, like South Sudan, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, Burundi, Somalia, Senegal, and there's the case of Aceh. The peace agreement in Aceh was concluded in 2005, and the United Kingdom Northern Ireland talks, bringing an end to the Irish Republican Army, was effectively concluded in 2006. However, by the second decade of the century, we saw the resurgence of many other conflicts, festering like the one in the Gaza Strip, Afghanistan, unsettled conflicts in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, some assuming new dimensions, such as what we're seeing now in Libya, Syria, Iraq, and of course in Ukraine, where we saw the unintended consequence of the shooting down of an airplane loaded with civilians in view of the ongoing offensives taking place in that part of the world. That is why it's not a small thing that in the Philippines, we were actually able to bring forward a peaceful settlement of a conflict that is Islamist in nature, which could easily find ties with other Islamic movements going on around the world and are generated largely through self-radicalization or the setting of self-driven jihadist cells. That is why in some quarters, this agreement is recognized as a model. In March last year, the Philippine government signed a historic agreement with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, the Comprehensive Agreement on the Bangsamoro, concluding 17 years of protracted negotiations and ushering the end of 4 decades of cyclical, deadly, damaging, and displacing armed conflict, which has resulted in no victors, only victims. At this time, the Bangsamoro Basic Law is being discussed in our legislature. It is basically the legal translation of the Comprehensive Agreement on the Bangsamoro and was submitted to the 2 houses of the Philippine Congress September of last year. Extensive public hearings have been conducted and finished by the House of Representatives, while the Senate is still to finish their public hearings. There has been some delay, though, in the legislative proceedings due to an unfortunate incident 6 weeks ago when a special action force of the Philippine National Police was able to neutralize a Malaysian terrorist in an area near the camps of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, but suffered 44 casualties. The possible involvement of the MILF has brought about public outrage and plenty of negative sentiments on the proposed Bangsamoro Basic Law. We are still hopeful, though, that ultimately reason will prevail over emotions, as well as a strong push from the President and congressional leaders will carry us through and lead to its approval by mid-year this year. Once the law is passed, a referendum in the affected geographical areas will be held, after which a transition authority will be established with members appointed by the President. They will hold office up to June 30 next year, after which they will be replaced by the regular Bangsamoro government to be elected in May 2016. In the meantime, we have a confidence-building program with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front so that people in former conflict areas can start feeling the dividends of peace. Called Sajahatra Bangsamoro, it aims to lift the health, education, and livelihood conditions of MILF communities, stop the degradation into poverty of the victims of war, and prepare them for their journey to self-governance and dignified way of life. Late last year, the government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front launched the Bangsamoro Development Plan, a short and medium-term strategic vision that sets a clear path to inclusive and sustainable peace and development. The plan was crafted from the hearts and minds of those who have struggled for so long to bring peace in the communities. But in every process, the quest for human security must be complemented by steadfast political security. Through the decommissioning of former combatants and putting their weapons beyond use, the Bangsamoro hopes to build a protective mantle against crime and terror, improve security conditions, and drive up investments. Pluralism is key to our efforts. We are bringing communities torn apart by conflict to the forefront of democratic participation, consensus building, and dialogic action. Where every voice is heard, people resolve their differences by voting with their hands, not their guns, leading to decisions and programs for the welfare of all. Yet, every peace process is unique. Every situation driven by violence and extremism has its own ideological, cultural, and historical underpinnings. Nevertheless, our experience in the Philippines teaches us that four imperatives are of primary importance in resolving violence and extremism and thereby enabling us to win the peace. These imperatives are leadership, trust, historical justice, and supportive consensus. For instance, we would never have reached this point in our search of enduring peace if it were not for the unswerving leadership of our President, Benigno S. Aquino III, and that of Chairman Alhaj Murad Ibrahim of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. We would never have reached this point without the sturdy bridge of mutual trust that has driven principled negotiations and earnest confidence building. We would have never reached this point if not for the promise of historical justice to right the wrongs of the past and repair the social, economic, cultural, and ethnic pain and damage inflicted upon the victims of war. We would never reach this point without the national, multi-sectoral, and interfaith consensus that peace is the only way, and also very important, we would never have reached this point without the collective backing of concerned nations and multilateral institutions. Through an inclusive and lasting peace, we want the Bangsamoro to be an anchor of common prosperity and collective security, not just for the Philippines, but for the region. We envision the Bangsamoro to be part of the larger perimeter of vigilance against the spread of extremism and a bridge of moderation among the great faiths of the world. The work may seem never-ending, but the rewards are great and infinite for us, for you, for this generation, and those that will come after it. Like the oceans, the waves of peace must be constant and unyielding as it surges and ebbs until it lands on all shores. Altogether, we are the wave of peace. We cannot stop until we rest on every shore on earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bachani. Well, there's quite a contrast between the experience in the southern Philippines, where, as you said, quite strikingly, these negotiations took 17 years before the comprehensive agreement was reached. That's quite a contrast with the situation in Aceh, where it was a matter of a year or so, 5 months before a final settlement was reached. So I think that illustrates the importance of persistence in negotiations. Thank you very much. Well, we've heard about the diverse experiences of Colombia, El Salvador, Aceh in Indonesia, the MILF in the southern Philippines. I think comparing experiences can be useful, though it is I think, quite difficult to draw out direct lessons from one particular context to another context, even within one region, let alone between regions. But I think that those four extremely interesting presentations will have provoked a lot of interest among delegates. We have slightly less than 30 minutes for questions and discussions, so in the normal fashion, please, if you could raise your name board, and I think we've got time to take maybe 5 or 6 questions, and I'll make a list. Thank you very much. Barry Desker from Singapore.
Thank you, Tim. I thought I'd like to introduce a different dimension to this discussion. And I would suggest that while in Southeast Asia, the conflicts that have been discussed are conflicts which are internal to the societies. However, the new problem that emerges is one of a more pan-Islamic character, which is a network dimension going beyond state-centered conflicts. The Jama'ah Islamiyah movement, for example, had its roots not just in any one country, but with members from Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, the southern Philippines, and southern Thailand. And I would suggest that if we look, given the speed at which ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Greater Syria has grown, and the influence it has had on Islamic radicalization and radical movements in the region, that this will be the next stage which governments will have to deal with. The problem is that we are dealing with the issue on a state-centered basis, but the movement that we are facing actually operates across borders in a very network-centric basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barry. Dr. Yusuf Mashal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Same as it's the conflicts that we have heard, I am from the Kingdom of Bahrain, and we did have a conflict. It also happened during what's called the Arab Spring. During that time in 2011, a lot of uprisings are happening within West Asia and North Africa. There were countries that they have overthrown their leaders, as we've seen in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya. It's still going on in Yemen. It's still going on in Syria. Bahrain is a small constitutional monarchy since 2002, and it was threatened at that same time by terrorist groups backed up by Iran, to thinking that they can ride the same boat of what's happening with the Arab Spring. However, the government of Bahrain was awake to such actions and stood hard for such terrorists backed up by Iran. Several steps were taken directly by His Majesty the King, where he first asked for a national dialogue that puts the whole spectrum of the society sit together, more than 300 of non-government societies sat together on a table and came up with some reforms that became a change in the constitutions after that. Then His Majesty has asked for an international commission of inquiry led by the famous Mr. Sharif Bassiouni. And this was asked to determine whether the events of February and March 2011 involved any violation of human rights. He also established a local committee to study the report of this commission and to implement whatever outcomes that came out. Also, he created a strong international media composing of all the embassies and the international media to clear that Bahrain is not having an uprising. Bahrain is having a terrorism backed up by Iran. His Majesty has saved Bahrain within less than 7 months. It would have been a definite sectarian war in Bahrain that would have been the same as Syria and the same as Iraq and same as Libya right now. I must conclude that political problems in Bahrain is not really over yet, but it is in the way to be resolved on the dialogue table and not through the machine guns. And the experience of His Majesty in Bahrain has really taught us that patience with leaderships that believes in no losers and dignity is preserved to all can save the country. And this is what I've seen yesterday in the speech of the President of Colombia, which I feel that he is on the same steps, and we wish the same thing will happen to Colombia very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marshall, for that perspective on the internal security problems in your own country, and for pointing out the importance of negotiations and patience. Ambassador Watanabe.
Muchas gracias. Soy embajador Japón.
Many thanks. I am the ambassador of Japan here in Colombia. During these 2 years, I have been observing and following up on what is occurring in Havana. I would also like to thank the 4 speakers for sharing their experiences with us. In regards to the peace negotiations in Colombia, we hope an agreement will be reached sooner or later. And secondly, after this agreement, perhaps there will be an approval on part of the people of Colombia. And third, there will probably be support and help from the international community, including Japan. But afterwards, there will be a very difficult period in time, and this is forgiveness and reconciliation. Within a family, if a member of the family, a son or a daughter, if they were killed by a FARC member, will they be forgiven? It's very difficult. It's very difficult. And I believe that on this point, I would like to ask Dr. Costa, in the case of the people of El Salvador, how they in El Salvador were able to overcome this issue of forgiveness and reconciliation. I would like to hear from General Naranjo and Dr. Costa. Many thanks.
And from the IISS, Antonio Sampaio.
Gracias. Me gustaría
Thank you. I would like to remind you that there's still a small presence of the Sendero Luminoso in the south of Peru. So I believe there is an incredible longevity of these groups in Latin America. Latin America is a very peaceful region, but the FARC is the oldest insurgency in the southern hemisphere. So I believe there is a problem both in regards to political motivations for the insurgencies as well as a connection with informal economies, illegal economies that promote or support this resistance and these insurgencies. So I would like to ask Gino Costa, what do you think of the remains of the Sendero Luminoso? What do you think of this resistance that they still have, even though it might be small, and that the state is much stronger now than it was before? And to General Oscar Naranjo, how can we be at peace that the FARC groups will now be a part of this peace process?
And now General Hassan.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Lieutenant General Atar Hasnan. I'm from the Indian Army, and I speak with about 40 years of experience as a conflict manager, from the tactical to the strategic level, in all insurgencies in India, and we've had many of them. But my remarks are not based upon any particular insurgencies, are generic remarks. Firstly, I would say Latin America, I think, is most fortunate today as being the only continent which is actually not affected in any way by the scourge of radical Islamic terrorism. I think it's a great opportunity for Latin America, that isolated as it is from this networked scourge which is troubling the world today. This is the opportunity which Latin America must actually take, and its relative peace which is existing, it must take it forward to achieve everything on the social and the economic front. Having said that, I have two observations primarily. The first is related to conflict termination and conflict resolution. And the main thing which I want to speak about is what I call the concept of victory. I think Dr. Jalal really outstandingly summed it up. Every nation has got its own concept of victory when it comes to fighting a conflict, an internal conflict. I would call Indonesia's example in Aceh as a fantastic act of prudence and its definition of its own concept of victory. But more often than not, you will find the nations have a problem with national ego. And national ego always leads to the problem of fighting the last mile of the conflict. When you fight the last mile in a kinetic way with the use of armies, you will always find that that conflict will continue to persist. And that's a great lesson which actually comes out of Indonesia. Having said that, I would also say that rebuilding societies, in the rebuilding of societies, the most important aspect we have to remember is that economics drives peace, but much more than economics, perhaps it is social engineering. And in social engineering, 3 or 4 issues which come to light straight away. One is, from my experience, the empowerment of women, the empowerment of youth, and my country is a country with 65% of the youth below 25 years of age today. The empowerment of youth through skill development and skill management, and then bringing in education, health services and jobs. It is this ultimately which leads to conflict termination and conflict resolution. With this in mind, what can we do actually to cooperate? And such a dialogue, how can it be made more effective? I think what we really need to do is to get think tanks of different countries, strategic think tanks of different countries. I know outstanding think tanks exist in Indonesia. I know they exist in Philippines. And we can have some great networking with these think tanks. And I think the mother organization of all this should be IISS. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. We have time for 2 more very, very brief points. Mr. Olbari.
Thank Thank you very much. I have a brief comment to request that General Naranjo please refer more broadly to the issue of justice in the context of the negotiations. I recall from your most recent ascension speech, from your second period, or in his speech, President Santos spoke of the efforts to end the conflict as a step towards holistic peace, and holistic peace as an instrument for the complete development of Colombia. He established a series of very important goals from the perspective of growth, education, social integration, etc. I believe that we could say that justice is something like the harpoon for the bridge that could drive from the end of the conflict to peace. But that arc poses some important challenges. On the one hand, the equilibrium to strike between peace and justice. How can we know how much is necessary in order to achieve what President Santos referred to last night, a maximum of justice in the context of peace? The other is the balance between reconciliation and accountability. Any society that has been as affected by a conflict as the Colombian one, a society in which atrocities have been committed, part of the population will expect certain accountability. So what I would like is for you to refer a little more specifically to these balances that are so difficult. Thank you.
There was someone at the back whose nameplate I couldn't quite read. He just raised his hand again. That will be the
Muchas gracias.
Yes, I can't.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, moderator. My name is Miguel Duran. I am the president of the Colombian Korean Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I would like, very briefly and succinctly, to exalt the analytical clarity with which General Naranjo exposed the crux of the current peace process in my country. I would like to summarize the points from each of the presenters on how the successful progress of peace has been achieved within the framework of these policies. I am absolutely convinced that the Colombian government fulfills the requirements in order to consolidate peace. First of all, we enjoy leadership. President Santos, not only as Minister of Defense, but as head of state, has known how to expertly and intelligently guide the entire process, despite the fact that we have not had a natural disaster as the tsunami that the representative from Indonesia mentioned. But we have had a political tsunami that was originated by a former head of state who experiences nostalgia for power. Secondly, we have pragmatism. The antecedents, as the general mentioned, we studied the precedent in 30-odd countries that experienced violence and tragedy of an ongoing war. With that criteria, President Santos looks to the future and has called on Colombians to feel the pain of 6 million victims, which are certainly calling for an end of the war. So this pragmatism has brought us to conceive of this policy of reconciliation in which every Colombian has his greatest hopes. It's a process that for the first time in the history of the world, generals and military men have taken the guerrilla head-on in order to de-escalate the war and consolidate peace. And I would also like to credit one of the delegates with regards to his comments on peace, forgiveness, and reconciliation. It's not easy, but I bore witness to a Colombian woman whose parents and siblings were killed. She arrived in Havana. She faced the guerrilla, analyzed the circumstances. The guerrilla apologized for the unbearable acts committed, and she granted them her forgiveness. That is political will in the interest of peace. And to that end, and under President Santos' policies, we have our greatest hopes. Thank you.
Important point. We're running out of time, but I would like each of our four panelists to have the chance to respond. If each of you could respond maybe in with a maximum of 3 minutes or so of comments, and I would like to ask you to respond in the reverse order. So Mr. Bachani first, and then Dino Patti Jalal, and thirdly Dr. Costa, and finally General Naranjo. Mr. Bachani, please. Thank you.
There's mentioned about the pan-Islamic radicalization. I think what's important here is interstate cooperation. I know for a fact that many countries are sharing intelligence information as far as some of the possible terrorists are concerned. In our particular case, I know some countries have shared information with us in terms of the possible presence of terrorists in southern Mindanao. I think that's very important. I'm not sure in terms of some formal mechanism on how to institutionalize that, because definitely there is a need for that. I think we have seen also there were some questions about transitional justice and reconciliation. I think this is very important in terms of especially post-agreement implementation, in terms of the mechanisms that will be instituted to really provide justice and reconciliation for the people who suffered. Yeah, I guess we also saw that as a common thread in all of these cases was the question of leadership. I think it was mentioned in the four cases that we heard this afternoon, how important leadership is in really trying to arrive at peaceful settlements and subsequent implementation of these agreements. That's all I can say for now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dino.
Thank you. I would like to add a little bit on the subject of forgiveness and reconciliation moving forward. I didn't talk about East Timor today because we didn't have time, but one of the things that we did during our time to heal the wounds from our the trouble that we had with Timor-Leste, with East Timor, was a visit by President Yudhoyono, emotional visit, both to the cemetery of Indonesian soldiers killed in Timor-Leste, in the capital of East Timor. And after that, after he paid tribute to the military cemetery, he went directly to the cemetery where Indonesian military officers shot at demonstrators, the Santa Cruz cemetery. That one move where he went to both cemeteries and paid respect to both was of enormous symbolic significance and sent huge political message to the Timorese that we are now in a new era. No previous president would dare, would take a political risk to visit the cemetery in Santa Cruz where Indonesian military had shot demonstrators. But President Yudhoyono took that risk, and afterwards there was an agreement made with Xanana Gusmao, the president of Timor-Leste, that the government of Timor-Leste would rehabilitate the cemetery of Indonesian military soldiers in Dili. So both sides got into the act of really reaching out and trying to forgive and promote reconciliation, led from the top, but felt by the grassroots. And that psychological impact really has helped to promote stable relations between Indonesia and Timor-Leste now. I think if you look at any areas around the world, there's hardly a case where two sworn enemies, such as Indonesia and Timor-Leste, with such a painful and bloody history, has become two neighbors in Southeast Asia region with the best relations. It's quite remarkable transformation of relationship. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right, and I second that your country and Timor have some of the best bilateral relations amongst Southeast Asian countries, which is absolutely remarkable. Dr. Gino Costa.
De acuerdo con...
I would agree with my friend Sampaio in that I had mentioned the defeat of the subversive Peruvian organizations in the early 90s. One of them, Sendero Luminoso, there were two groups that survived and that retreated into inaccessible areas of the Colombian territory, Coca Valleys in effect, and there they were able to maintain and prolong their survival in territories that were very focused, difficult to access. Therefore, it was very difficult to eradicate them militarily speaking. In 2011, in one of those valleys, saw the defeat of one of those groups, a definitive defeat after many years of progressive weakening. The Sendero Luminoso persists in another valley, although very run down. So we believe that even in Peru, we are coming to the end of this second cycle because the strategic defeat took place more than 20 years ago. But these two last vestiges still existed, and it's highly likely that in the next years, this process of elimination will continue to consolidate itself. There is a relationship to illegal economies because these groups exist in coca valleys, but they are not the armed expression of the drug trafficking because not all the coca valleys have military operations. So more likely it is a political objective that uses illegal trade such as the drug trade. I would also like to agree with our friend from India, mentioned as well by another one of the members who intervened, in the sense that we are very lucky in Latin America to not have to face the threat of Islam fundamentalism. This is not present in our region, which is very fortunate, certainly. But in addition, to answer to Ambassador Watanabe, another point is that we speak the same language, we share a culture and a religion, so these conflicts are more political and ideological than anything else, without the presence of religious differences or ethnic differences, or even linguistic ones. So resolving these conflicts, despite how difficult it is perhaps easier than in situations where there are also religious and linguistic differences. That's another advantage that we enjoy. And to answer Ambassador Watanabe's question, I believe that the negotiating process itself is where the reconciliation germinates. It is later much easier to take it to the rest of society if leaders are committed to that process of reconciliation, which is what I believe took place in Salvador. Certainly, immediately after the signing of peace, it's important to maintain vigilance in order to avoid phenomena of violence which could turn the process back, which is why I said in Salvador, international presence was very helpful to ensure peace building. I'd like to wrap up by saying that I think that happily in Latin America, we are a region without interstate conflicts, almost without. The few that exist are being sorted out by the International Court in The Hague. The few conflicts with regards to mostly maritime borders. and the few armed conflicts are being wrapped up as well. So the great challenges in terms of security have more to do with what could be called ordinary or petty crime, which continue to be important challenges, and they affect the quality of life of those of us who live in this region. But they are less delicate and less difficult to address than the armed internal conflicts and the interstate conflicts. Thank you.
Optimistic point. And finally, General Naranjo.
Bueno, dado que tengo el
Given that I have the privilege of closing this panel, and as I said in my initial presentation, I am forced to stand in order to answer you. The truth is that after listening to these illustrious panelists, and particularly after listening to the questions and reflections of our guests, I would like to mention 3 or 4 points that we consider crucial. There's the general issue of leadership. I believe that the Colombian process, the negotiation of conflicts throughout the world and here in Colombia, imply that political leadership is stronger than discourse based on fear as a political mobilizer. There can be no doubt that after decades of violence in our country, but also throughout the world, fear has been the foundation for putting together political arguments and creating consensus. I feel that the new leadership, the leadership that generates trust in the ability to resolve these conflicts, should be a leadership that puts together its discourse from the need to generate trust, which is another factor that was mentioned on the stage as critical to success. And with that faith and that trust in the present, we can transform the future, generating hope in that future. If we take a look at what happens in Colombia, we could say that leadership is fractured between those who are hawking fear and those who believe that we have come to a time where it's necessary to build trust and create hope for the future. 2, I would say that the negotiation of this conflict in Colombia, the government is realistic and sees it under the context of what is taking place globally and regionally. And here I would make an observation, especially for our guests from the Trans-Pacific Alliance who observe us from across the Pacific. From the close to 500,000 homicides that the world produces in a year, 136,000 homicides take place in Latin America, which is to say that Latin America is today the most violent region of the world and contributes with 36% of the homicides in the entire planet, which is why a country like ours that is seeking to give an end to a conflict is also bearing a sign, hope for the world, that we want to reduce violence in Latin America, and therefore that realism, as Gino said, can take us to consider that the need to work for the post-conflict from now in order to not allow that crime reestablish itself, that is the objective of the government and the objective it has taken to the negotiation table. And the national government, through what the president has determined will be a ministry for post-conflict. 4th, I would say that in the case of Colombia, in order to give our compatriots certainty, but also to the international community, is that the affairs of the DDR, these issues are central to the agreement. Peace in this process, under the government's concept, is that peace means more security, not moving back in terms of security. And to this end, we have taken careful note of the lessons closest to us, most of them in Central America. When you speak to a Central American citizen, they may say that there was less violence during the war than now with the signed peace agreements. So what we are seeking now as we end this conflict is that in order to take peace to deep Colombia, We need to generate citizenship so that citizens can exercise their freedoms and their rights. And we also need to take the market to these remote reaches of Colombia so that the guerrilla will fall apart as an economic necessity. And this ties in to the question with regards to justice, which I enormously appreciate. Peace can only be guaranteed if a society understands that justice is necessary. But here, we're talking about a need that the contemporary globalized world has imposed upon us for the resolution of conflict. We say this once and again, we are the first country in the world to negotiate the solution to a conflict politically under the Rome Statutes. And that means that there will not be general amnesties, and therefore there will not be a cosmetic peace masked by amnesties. Having said that, we are aware that humanity and its legal developments have given life and light to a right that is part of transitional justice. What I am referring to is that we're not applying regular justice. We are facing the enormous challenge of assimilating the challenges of transitional justice, which is about resolving conflicts in our particular case. What does this mean? In a very real manner, it means changing paradigms and beginning to notice that justice, when we are resolving a conflict, is not limited exclusively to the law, criminal law, or the imposition of sanctions, punitive sanctions. Here, we need a combination, as provided for by the pillars of transitional justice, between truth, rights to non-repetition, reparations, and justice. These are the balances that we must seek out so that Colombians, in consensus, can solve these wounds and heal them. And here I would like to repeat what was said earlier here, is how much justice versus how much forgiveness? How much justice versus how much peace? Those are the questions. And here I would say, I would rescue the old aphorism by Tony Blair with his third way idea, where he pointed out that in terms of economics, what should be imposed is as much state as is necessary and as much market as possible. So here I would say as much justice as is necessary and as much truth as possible as foundations for the reparations, the right to non-repetition, and the possibilities of reconciliation. Finally, this has been mentioned by earlier panelists. In the Colombian case, despite 5 decades of violence, what we are finding is an enormously constructive and brave message built through a narrative that is truly moving, which is the narrative of the victims. Victims are the ones that, with greatest vehemence, are willing to forgive and reconcile. So therefore, the question is, what's happening with the rest of Colombians? And I would say that we cannot lose sight of the fact that in Colombia, not like in other conflicts, we are a nation where conflict, post-conflict, and normality are coexisting. We're not talking about a single nation involved in the conflict, because the entire nation will not move into post-conflict at the same time. These different realities are all mixed in time. Our conflict has been taking place in rural Colombia, a Colombia that we could call deep Colombia, where our state has only very precariously entered with military or with police, but has been unable to take more justice, more citizenship, and more market. Therefore, for the urban Colombian, the modern Colombian, a Colombian in a city as wonderful as Cartagena, or in Bogota, or Medellin, the conflict seems remote. And finally, we can say that a good amount of our compatriots of that more normal, more urban country see the conflict as something so distant that they are almost in a comfort zone, where resolving the conflict isn't even so important to them. The great political challenge is for all of us in Colombia be able to show that peace in Colombia will bring fruits for all Colombians, and that peace is not just a matter of putting end to the guns, but that peace is for democracy and democratic values to go deeper, so that ultimately we can respond to citizen outrage. The outrage that we saw in the Arab Spring, but that is also very near to us. Outrage that demands that the state be more effective, more competent, and near to citizens, so that political leadership generates trust, commitment for each citizen. The peace for Colombians is the opportunity for a second democratic wave, which since the birth of our republic, it's a new opportunity to renew markets and take a higher quality of life to our citizens. And it's an opportunity to pay our debts with the thousands, millions of victims that this conflict has generated. Thank you.
General, thank you for those stirring and at the same time very, very wise comments, which I think bring this session to an end in the best possible way. I would like to thank you and the other three panelists for your excellent presentations and for your responses to the points raised by our delegates, and to our delegates for the good questions that you raised and for your participation. Before we end this session, I have just two points to bring to your attention. First, the dinner this evening, the gala dinner, will be in the Hilton Gardens, and the dinner will commence at 8 p.m. in about 1 hour and 40 minutes time. And secondly, regarding tomorrow's sessions, the special sessions will commence at 0900 hours, 9 a.m. So please make sure that you're here in the appropriate room that you've been allocated to for your special session a little bit early. Thank you very much, and please enjoy the evening. Thank you.